started. All right.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Audrey, for the time. Thank you. It is an honor to have the time. We're very pleased for that. We would like to first share with you briefly the work we are doing, and after that, to move on and ask you on your vision of the future of democracy.
Okay.
So why do we want to discuss the future of democracy? It's because this is the focus of our organization. Tribu was established in order to address the opportunities, the challenges, and the dilemmas around the design of new institutional frameworks for democracy. Um, when we say that, we're thinking of things like sortition, the idea of liquid democracy, and other things like that. No? It is in order to learn from practice that we are putting some ideas of that into place within the framework of open government to improve local government or to improve the lawmaking process. But our focus is to promote the transition towards a new system. We really like the work that you're doing in Taiwan, which is very innovative, but it is focused on improving what we have. How do you how do you see, how do you imagine the transition towards new forms of democracy in the from now to 2050, or to the year you think it might be necessary for we living in new frameworks? No? We learned to understand democracy as a fixed thing. Um, but yeah, so my initial question is, how do you imagine the transition from what we have now to a different system that take the basis of democracy but redesign the tools?
What are the bases of democracy?
I think that's a key
That's a
question.
good
I
question.
think maybe that's the most important question. The way we understand it is a way of living together in which we recognize each other as equal members of a society, in order to, and we organize, recognizing that in order to live in diversity, free and fulfilled. That would be for us, is what we think give the basis for the system we know, but we also recognize that the capabilities we have and the challenges associated with have are different. So this idea of deciding together the way we want to live together might be done in a very different way, not necessarily by voting, not necessarily with representative. Maybe it does not. We think this is something is not receiving in the attention, the level of attention it should be receiving. Um, so yeah, that's
So what I hear from you is three things, right? First, realizing that each of us have our differences
yes,
of what a good life is.
yes,
And second, the capability of reaching decisions,
yes,
but without any particular vision of good life dominating
Yes.
the decision making,
Yes.
so that it inputs from everyone who could be affected by such a decision. So that's the second.
yes,
And the third thing is that it is not limited to voting or to any particular toolkit. As long as the end is met, as long as we can find things that we can live with that improve the good life according to each of our definitions,
Yes.
You are not constrained by the ballot box or by any other mechanism that has been designed before.
Yeah.
So did I get you correct?
Yes, you did. Thank you for the sum up.
Okay, so in that case, then there are things that we can change freely, such as the process and the tools.
Yes.
And the things that we must keep the same, which is this respect for diversity,
Yes.
right? Because if we design a process, but it only includes people who are very good at typing at keyboard,
Yes.
then it essentially makes people more alike,
Yeah.
but only in its capability by excluding people who
Yes.
are not like people who type very efficiently.
Yeah.
And then that is not democracy, right? It becomes a new form of elitism, and that basically dictates what the society wants. It creates a new norm based on what technologists think is the good life, and inflict it on the rest of society. And that, I think, is not what you mean by democracy. I think what you meant by democracy is that people, even if they're not that adept at typing a keyboard, should have a say, and even more of a say than before, in decisions that affect them. Did I get that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, right. So the way in Taiwan we do this is that we bring technology to the people. We never ask people to come to technology. And this is very important, because if we bring technology to the people, then the technologists must answer to the existing norm of people, of how they want to live a good life together, and identify the points where they find is too troublesome, too tiring, too much of a chore to participate in decision making. For example, it is impossible for most people to read through 5 pages of bureaucratic speech and budget item.
Yeah.
So if we prepare 500 pages of budget item for people to read, none of the people would go to the 5th page. They stop at the 3rd page and say, what does this have to do with me?
Yes.
And so even we can say we're 100% transparent, it means nothing. Because it is only useful for people who can use Excel, or people who can use other tools that make sense out of those numbers, out of those budget items. So participatory budgeting, while it is one of the more accepted new forms of democracy, doesn't make sense to me unless a narrative, a storytelling device is made so that people can interrogate the budget
Yes.
in a way that makes sense to them, in local language, in even indigenous languages, in the local culture, as I don't know, comic books, or even as television shows, or anything that makes them feel that, oh, this is relevant because I can identify the part of my living that may be affected by the upcoming budget. So until this narrative building is done, to me, we cannot move to the next phase of democracy, because people's imagination is constrained by the experience they have at the ballot box and nothing more. And so to me, as a radically transparent digital minister, my work is just to provide the storytellers the raw material for them to tell story. And sometimes we call them investigative journalists. Sometimes we call them civil society group who empower people. Sometimes we call them social entrepreneurs. It doesn't matter which label we call them. They are people who can take the raw material that the government is made of, the meeting minutes, the data that we collect and we publish as soon as it's collected, the raw material of government, and turn it into engaging narratives that people feel are relevant to their community. So this is the first step toward a new democracy. The second step is to have people get into the habit of just talking with people who have very different positions than them, and figure out common values together. In Taiwan, we have a word called 共识, which translates to common understanding. So it's not consensus. Consensus is too strong. Consensus is something you can sign your name on. It takes forever to reach consensus. And usually the people with the most time win this deliberation anyway. If what you're aiming for is consensus, people will just hold the microphone and keep saying things. Or if you're using a cyber way to engage, people with too much time on their hand just keep typing until they drive everybody away. And so if we're aiming for consensus, a fine consensus, it excludes people with little time. But if what we're aiming for is just consent or rough consensus or just general things that we can live with, then people can just put in 5 minutes of time, engage a little bit, feel that they're informed a little bit, but nevertheless see that actually most people agree on most of the things most of the time. It's just the television that amplifies maybe the 5 divisive issues. But actually this process lets everybody see that actually people have more commonalities than they care to initially admit. And so this is the most important picture in this whole conversation, is that when people put in 5 minutes to such a online deliberative consultation, people can clearly see, while the politicians want to emphasize the ideologies, actually most people agree on most of the things most of the time. And this is what we reveal to people in a kind of reflective space. So this space has 2 properties. First, it's open, meaning anyone can add their sentiment to it, but without taking anything away. You cannot troll other people. And the second thing is that it's reflective, meaning that people see the collective image of themselves. And so they can start thinking, oh, maybe the people who live near me is not that different from me. After all, in the ultimate values, we have different culture, we have different position, and we have different ideology, but the communal values, we actually have 90% in common. While the television talk about the 10%, that is the difference. We have 90% in common. And that is the second step. After building the narrative and context, the second thing is to see the shared values in a reflective space. And then the third thing, I think, again, the most important in my mind, is that we let various different governance forms to have the capacity to try and fail and to try and fail. We must encourage every city, every municipality, every district to try a different way to set their common visions based on the shared understanding and narrative building, and give them resources, both in time, in attention from the ministers, in budget, in impact investment and whatever, so that just like participatory budgeting reserves a percentage away from the city council, so that representative democracy decides a fraction of the budget, but then participative democracy decides another percent of the budget. This is a very common scenario in many cities.
Yes.
So in regional revitalization plan in Taiwan, we have the rural, the indigenous, the places decide 10% of the total social development budget by themselves in scenario planning meetings. But every district chooses a different way to go about it. So some fail, but that's fine because it's all open. The transcript is there for everybody to see, so they can try a different facilitative method the next time. For example, in activity called Presidential Hackathon, we use a new voting method called quadratic voting.
Okay.
And every citizen is given 99 points. They have 100 disruptive innovation in civil sector to choose from, and they can vote one item that will cost them 1 point. But if they vote 2 votes on the same item, that costs 4 points, and 3 votes, 9 points, 4 votes, 16 points. So people will be discouraged from just voting everything to one item. Instead, they're encouraged to look at synergy. What 5 projects works really well together, and they can vote for those 5. And the total vote they have is more than one that's just put everything into one bucket. And this voting innovation makes people think about synergy, instead of about polarization. And so then we select the 20 teams that has the most number of this quadratic votes and have the president see a demo of 10 of them after 3 months of co-creation and choose 5 each year and say the winning team, the 5 teams, get a trophy from the president, but there is no money. The trophy is just a projector that if you turn on, shows the president handing the trophy to you. And so that means the president promised by the end of next year, so in 9 months, we commit to do whatever it takes, budget, personnel, regulation, to turn that idea into reality in Taiwan's public service. So every year we can try 5 fresh ideas in governance in a way that is totally unrelated to voting, to representative voting in the traditional ballot box way. Because using quadratic voting, people directly work with things, with ideas, with opinions. People don't work with other people to defer their decision-making power to the representatives. And so my final answer to you is that after the narrative building and the sharing of common values and the experiments, we must conclude this loop by giving more and more of space away from representative democracy to deliberative democracy. And it's not overnight. We can just give 5 projects per year. Maybe it becomes 10 next year, maybe become 20 next year. Maybe the participatory budgeting gets 5% this year, maybe it gets 10% next year. But the point is that they can coexist until one day people feel comfortable with the new system and the old system become obsolete. People just stop thinking it's a good idea. And that is how we effect system change.
How do you see for today's world the way in general congresses work around the world, and the idea that we elect one person that represents us for a long time in all the matters?
So I think there are different independent councils for different matters now. So it's not just Congress at the moment. I think in Taiwan, we have the same voting day last time for referendum and also for councillors. And so they represent, and mayors, and so they represent 2 different tracks of democracy. Sometimes the referendums point out what people generally want. Like people want to legalize marriage equality by law. But people also through referendum tells us that they don't want it to share the same status of in-laws in the legal system. Because in Taiwan, as in other places in East Asia who are of a Confucius tradition, we have 16 words for aunt and uncles. And this family tree, the kinship, the in-law relationship is really important and is part of the civil code. But that gets disrupted if you introduce marriage equality for same-sex couples. The old words need to be renewed, and people are not comfortable with that. So through referendum, they say it's great to have the same laws for the right to marry, to file taxes, for inheritance, for everything, and it's okay to call it a marriage. But the old in-law structure must remain untouched. So that's what people tells us through referendum. And it's up to the lawmakers to make sure that they can write something that specifies exactly as what the referendum has asked. And so I think it's like design thinking. You have the discovery, you have the definition to a shared understanding. And then you have the implementation and then delivery. And for this part, I think having a career public service is important. And in systems where people elect the parliament in MPs that also serves as ministers, it's also important because somebody has to come to share the narrative of why the implementation has fit the referendum. And so having essentially someone who facilitates the conversation between the deliberation results or the referendum results and the actual implementations, a explanatory role is still very important. So to talk, to parler, right? It's what parliament means, to speak through the consequence of lawmaking. But the first diamond, the one that discover what people want, the one that discover what people's common values are, I don't think we need specific people to do that. I think everybody can do that, and indeed we should do it all together through a collective intelligence process that takes into account the wisdoms and the various ways of people convening. As long as we can create an open space to amplify their voices, it should be just a job for lawmakers to take those consensus items and make them into workable implementations. So in a sense, they're like the coders, whereas the people, the collective intelligence, are like the designers of collective decision making at this stage.
In that sense, I'm connecting with what you were saying at the beginning about bringing tech to the people, but also means bringing tech people to think
Yes.
in the needs of the
Exactly.
society in general.
Yes.
What do you think are the keys in order to advance in that direction? Because we can see everywhere, almost everywhere, a lot of interest in the artificial intelligence,
Yes.
and the effects of artificial intelligence.
Yes.
But it's in general it's with a different approach. The same happened with blockchain technologies. Last few years, you've been using technology a lot,
Yes.
but with this very different approach.
Yes.
What are the keys in also when you involve a team, and you lead them this way? What could you share us?
Yes. So I think the language is important. I don't say artificial intelligence. I say assistive intelligence. I don't say machine learning. I say collaborative learning. Like that is to say humans and machines together. Right? I don't say virtual reality. I say we build a shared reality. I say Internet of Beings, not Internet of Things. I talk about human experience. I don't talk about user experience because that's just a narrow thing, right? But human experience is larger. And we hear about singularity when it comes to AI, but I talk about plurality. So basically, having the right language matters. So for example, you say tech people, but I don't use that description. I say people who can code, people who can design, people who can do project management. It's the same as saying, so someone is a people with blindness instead of blind people. If you say blind people, it's like they are a race, a tribe, and that pushes like us versus them. But if you say people with blindness, then we are all just people, and we have different capabilities and conditions, and it's just fine. And so I think the key here is to stop thinking tech people as somehow a different race of people. It just happens to be someone who can speak French, but you don't say they're French people because they learn French, right, somewhere. And so people who can write JavaScript, it's not Java people. There are Java people in Java. It's just people who learn to write JavaScript. Right? And so it's important to emphasize that we share the same human values and we use the different skill sets. So people who know distributed ledgers are great because they can help us to safeguard the individual measurement of air quality and water quality and make sure we cannot tamper with each other's numbers. That's great because they know distributed ledgers, but they're not blockchain people.
Yep.
And so I think that is the key here.
And also, sorry, it gives space for other people who don't define themselves, who don't know that they are tech people. For instance,
Exactly.
You give them space to get in.
Exactly.
That space.
Exactly. So I think
So it's very inclusive.
in
very,
all
very
our
broad.
hackathons, the only thing in common is that we have excellent food. Because so far we haven't seen anyone who say, I'm a person who don't eat. Maybe intravenous, right, if they're really sick. But even for that we have ways. But in usual cases, people enjoy really good food and drink together. And that's the thing that unites us. And then people just come for food and sharing and having really good conversations, and that's all. In a hackathon in GovZero, you don't have to produce anything. You don't compete for prizes. You don't have to deliver on projects or even ship prototypes or even learn to code. But it ended up all of it happening. But people just arrive saying, oh, I want to share food. And they get drawn into interesting projects. And then they started learning code. And before they know it, they become coders. And that is interesting because they're people first. And people who enjoy other people first. And then people who can code.
So sorry, one more thing is that in this concept of democracy that I'm understanding now from your point of view, you start from understanding that we are all one.
That's right.
Okay, so all the language, all the narrative has to do with that. Instead of being counterparts,
Yes.
one against the other, is we are all together.
That's right. Because we're literally together, right? If you look at the Earth from the International Space Station with virtual reality, you realize that it's clouded by the clouds if you're on the ground. But if you look at from the space, it's just this fragile little sign.
Yes.
And you can't really escape from Earth. I guess you can now to the International Space Station, but not much farther, right? And so, of course, we are one, and there's nowhere else to run, right? So for things like climate change, for things like the global ecosystem, the biodiversity, and things like that, it's not like you can say, oh, it's some other tribe's business, because you can't push those things away.
When we start from the same base.
When we decided.
One more thing is that the language we use or the principle that we use, how to lower the limits between the us and the others.
That's right.
Let me complement on that. When we decided that because Tribu was founded on that idea, on the seek of an institutional framework that could incentivize us to interact on a daily basis as being conscious of being part of one thing. That's why we decided to call it Tribu, because if we would understand that we are all part of one tribe or one existence, so we would interact in a different way. And that's the way we approach democracy, the political aspect of this more existential.
Right. So which is why the rough consensus diagram you just saw is so important, because we're not literally the same, right? We're not cookie cutter robots. No. So we're not 100% the same. But we're 95% there, right? We have our differences, and that is fine. But we're mostly the same. And that is what is important to get into people's just intuitive feeling that we're mostly the same. And we celebrate then the differences. But we're not saying that we're totally different and we're just incidentally speaking the same language, or we're just incidentally living in the same town, right? So you have to start from the part that are the same, that we become ourselves because we support each other in this sameness. And the African people have a word for that, it's Ubuntu. And that is the basis of humanity.
When we, at the beginning, looked at the liquid democracy idea, we saw a way to address a current problem, which is that people that hold political power does not interact on a daily basis as part of the same community with those that they represent. At
Exactly.
least is what we see in Chile and other countries around. So we were looking for a way in which holding the political power is distributed so as it doesn't divide society between some people and others. We are not focused on defending that model, but on understanding what are other tools and ways to advance. No? In particular, regarding that idea that I know you know about, what are your thoughts?
I think liquid democracy is a incremental improvement because you still vote for people.
Okay.
It's just that not every 4 years, but rather every 4 hours. That's the real difference, right? It makes it more interactive, more in real time, and you can delegate different part of responsibility to different people that you trust. So it is actually just like representative democracy in fast forward.
Yep, 2.0.
Yeah, in fast forward. So the great thing about that idea is that it builds on something that people already understand. So you can easily introduce it to people. But the weakness of that idea is that it doesn't fundamentally change the what we call the principal agent problem. There is still an agent that acts on behalf of a principal, and it is up to the agent to demonstrate that they have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of people who delegate power to them. And so it's exactly the same as a congressperson. It's just on a faster speed and on a smaller scale, which makes it, I think, better, but it doesn't fundamentally solve that problem. It's still representatives, not representation. And the way that I've been working is more on the idea of representation as in presenting what people's ideas and feelings and whatever are, but representing the same idea in ways, in modalities that people with a different culture can easily understand. So if there are an indigenous elder telling the wisdom in their culture, it is the role of us as representation system builders to make sure that this narrative makes equal sense as a cultural translator to people who think in terms of KPIs and numbers and indicators and a very different culture than the indigenous wisdom. We need to make sure that the translation works both ways. So our way of visualizing people's consensus respect that they are all individually there. Each thought is exactly as it has been said by a person. You can all drill down to the original way that people said it, but we aggregate it in a way that makes sense overall to people who think in pictures, or people who think in numbers, or people who think in logic, or people who think in different modalities. So that is our main goal, is just to present people's feelings in a way that resonates more easier with other people. And to that end, we still use voting, but we always vote on each other's feelings, and each vote, upvote or downvote, only say whether I resonate with this or not. It is not a personal rank. It's not an Uber driver rating their passengers or the other way around. This is more of a, I resonate with the sentiment, I don't resonate with the sentiment, and that's it. And so with this kind of voting, people learn that you can vote very easily on a very fine-grained way on individual ideas and feelings, and contribute their own ideas and feelings in a way that doesn't consume as much cognitive resource as totally delegating some responsibility to a representative. So one acts on ideas and one acts on people. That is how this way of representation is different from the liquid representation. And they're, I think, good for different domains. But I'm more well-versed in the space for this and less well-versed in the liquid space.
And that space is the space of common understanding
Yes,
that you were
yes,
mentioning.
yes. So it doesn't have to be referendum. Sometime at the end of a deliberation, people just feel that they are a tribe again. They inform each other. They can see from each other's position. There need to be no law or regulation. Just this feeling is sufficient sometimes.
And do you think that that kind of living democracy, running democracy, can be institutionalized
Yes.
in a way that does not depend to have someone as committed and as clear as you are?
Yes. Yeah, I always design myself out.
Okay.
So everything that I just mentioned, the participation officers, the e-petition, the presidential hackathon, everything has a national regulation that spells out very clearly how to run it. And so it's not dependent on the digital minister. Anyone can go and take those like cooking recipes and replicate that in their municipality. It's often much easier in a municipality than the central government, simply because they are closer to people. And it's even easier in a township and even easier in an apartment. And so people can just take those same tools and scale it deeply to the different corner. That's why I say let the swarms of experiments begin, and we in the central government just highlight the best practices, or at least the better practice, and make sure everybody knows about it.
And do you have a name for that? Have you a name for this? I am really
I call it listening at scale.
listening
At scale.
Yeah.
And are there countries or cities replicating?
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah, and we also learn from our international counterpart. We're a large community, right? The Desi Day in Madrid
Yes.
is a constant source of inspiration. They took our tools, we took their tools. Better Reykjavik from Iceland is a best idea for the e-petition part, which we just copied everything from their interface. And we have people in New York City and now in New Jersey replicating what we have, but adding more variations to it. Our friend in Canada actually added bilingualism to our process so that they can have English and French deliberating with machine translation automatically happening in between. And now we're contributing to that by building a US-Taiwan conversation, a digital dialogue. If you search for digital dialogue AIT, you will see the same conversation, but you can type in Mandarin and it gets translated to English and vice versa, so that people from two cultures can share the same common understanding thanks to machine translation. So that is, again, a way to push towards the idea of that we're not fundamentally different just because we don't speak each other's language.
that's only a tool.
It's only a tool, yes.
Right.
From who else are you learning? Yesterday you mentioned that you have invited several people from Estonia.
Yes,
What other good examples do you see around?
yes. Estonia is really good at explaining the technological process behind the civil society questions. For example, they may ask about this privacy of e-voting. They may ask about the data agency of having a national e-ID system. They may ask, where are my records? I entrust the government with this data. Are the governments misusing my data? How can I know that they're acting in my best interest? And the Estonians have developed a very good accountable system that is not open source in the sense that people can take and change it, but it is public source, meaning that people can look at the source code and see for themselves that this is trustworthy, or at least they can find a person, a friend who can code to verify this. And so if they vote through the internet, they can always override it using in the ballot box. And
Yes.
so basically the idea is that the digital is there to make things easier, but it doesn't take anything away. And so this idea is very powerful, and we're learning that from them.
By the way, what do you think of online voting?
So I think online voting is great if you're not voting for your president. Online voting is great if you're just highlighting the blind spot that other people are not seeing. So like for agenda setting, the earlier the process, the better the online is, because it's just brainstorm. The later the process is, the more incentive there will be to hijack and game the system, and less suited will be the online voting. And so I think online voting is only useful if it's early and if it affects mostly priorities and things rather than people. And that's my understanding.
Because of the technologies could be hacked at a later stage.
It's not about hack. It's about fundamentally you don't know the secrecy of online voting. You don't know whether the person who do the online voting has someone else pointing a gun at them. Supposedly you can solve vote buying and coercion through multi-round of prolonged voting a little bit. You can deploy decoy ballots. You can deploy a random sampling that is independent of the decoy ballots. So there are mathematical ways to get around this issue. But to some point, people stop feeling like that they are own the process anymore. At some point, people start to feel like we're just following the steps from a mathematician that we don't understand. So I think online voting is possible if and only if everybody learns to code at a very young age, and everybody learns to own data as data stewardship at a very young age. So if we raise a generation of people who can code and who can understand the mathematics behind sortation, behind random sampling, behind decoy ballots, then of course they will feel it's natural to use online voting. But it's our job to make that world, but it is not our job to make everybody follow that world's rules before that world actually appears.
Can I ask one question? Is that I'm very interested in your wide view of everything, and it's more like a change of consciousness. Your consciousness is very expanded. You can see clearly the processes. Why do you believe all the structures and institutions are falling apart right now at this era? What's going on?
Yeah, so I think that is because for the first time, this distance between any two persons become topological and at the speed of light. It used to be that the institutions are the way to organize people and make arbitrations, trade-offs, and make decisions, because that was the most useful way to organize. And then came radio and television. And with those technologies, suddenly the symmetry is broken, because one person can easily talk to a million people and start a world war just by doing that, but no way to listen from 100 people even. So it became fundamentally asymmetrical, and it gives rise to fascism. It gives rise to totalitarianism just because of this technology of broadcasting. And now, of course, people invented new institutions to counter that. People invented investigative journalism. People invented a way to check and balances in a liberal democracy, the so-called fourth estate, and things like that. But then it came another technology revolution, the internet, meaning that for the first time, it costs nothing to listen to 1,000 people. And you can choose among the world's population the 1,000 people that think like you and become a tribe and think everybody else is crazy, right? With the internet, everybody can do that very easily. And because of that, people stop to practice the art of truly listen to one another. So we can listen to thousands of people who think just like us. We can speak to thousands of people who think just like us, but we lose the ability for 1,000 people to sit down and listen to each other despite their differences, because the internet doesn't encourage that in its current incarnation. But it gives a false sense of closeness, of tribalism, so that while the institution, the government, the media, the large co-ops or corporations, they used to give account to people like regularly, every quarter or things like that. It used to feel like it's okay distance, but then people interact with their online tribe every second, and because of that, psychologically, they feel much closer to the online tribe than with institutions. So the trust falls apart because people say our government is not trusting us enough because they're not responding to my inquiries within an hour. But my friends online all do that. So we are closer to those friends. And once those friends start to spread disinformation or rumors or outrage or stories that are simply false, then the trust in institution pales in comparison with this outrage. And so in Taiwan, all the ministries, whenever there is a rumor going around, are now required to, within 1 hour, to produce videos or at least pictures that explain the context of the policy, featuring cuts or other cute live streaming memes, to make sure that people can get a quick response from the ministers as fast as their friends on the internet, so that they again feel that we're close to the people. And that is why I open every Wednesday. Anyone can come to my office hour and talk to me for 40 minutes. And we live stream or at least videotape or release the transcript, so everybody can see with radical transparency how is it like to be a digital ministry. That restores the distance. So again, they feel digital ministry is close to them. And that is really the only way that we can win back the trust. It's just by trusting people enough to treat them like adults and interact with them as we would on our online friends. And that is really, I think, the only way to combat disinformation and the rise of totalitarianism again.
And fake news.
And exactly, and intentional harmful untruths.
Okay. Audrey, could you tell us what's the state of the work you've been doing using virtual reality tools to create this shared reality that we have?
Yes.
And and what's the state of it, and what have you learned?
Yes. So I regularly visit other places in Taiwan outside Taipei. And when I do that in rural or indigenous places, I make sure that I connect the decision makers in Taipei, in Taoyuan, in Taichung, in Kaohsiung through projectors, so that we connect different rooms together, so that people in the indigenous tribes, the elders, or in rural areas, don't feel that Taipei is very far away. They can feel that they're sitting with the central government ministries, and they can just have a conversation just like adults between people. And so instead of saying, you have to sign your idea as a PowerPoint, a Word document, and we'll pass it to the Ministry of Finance, to the Ministry of Economy, to the Ministry of Interior, and then it loses the context, the life of the scenario planning, of the deliberation. We just bring those ministries in the same room in different cities, municipalities, and connect the rooms together so that people see each other eye to eye and feel that they are in the same space and share the same story. And I usually just go there a day before or even 2 days before to hang out with local people. So I have some idea of what they're talking about. But it's only me that traveled. Everybody else who want to attend, they can also put on Oculus and just join in 360 live streaming in our collaboration meetings. And so it becomes something that people think, oh, it's just amplifying our conversation. It's not replacing anything. It's just letting people who are far away, who want to be part of a conversation, be part of the conversation. And that is what we have learned. It's best if we see it as just something that is there, instead of seeing it that we have to adjust to fit there.
I'm sorry, I lost.
No, it's okay.
I have so many questions. I'm trying to choose one. I have one question that's different to everything else, but what is the deepest thing you've learned from the elders of your country?
Yes, the indigenous spirits in Taiwan, I think they taught us that Taiwan itself has life before human beings came. It was 4 million years ago that the land that we now know as Taiwan began to rise. It is the Eurasian plate on one side, the Philippine Sea plate on the other. They run into each other and they give birth to an island, to the Jade Mountain, to the highest mountain. And the elders, they like to say that the spirit of these mountains are the true living beings. And we are here to safeguard the beings that are those mountains. And the mountains are alive because we can see the Jade Mountain growing 5 centimeters every year. It is a geological fact. We have lots of earthquakes, but because of that, all the mountains are growing. And it's the role of human beings to make sure that they continue to grow, to not destroy the ecology, to safeguard this place so that when we no longer are the only sentient being, we can have some other sentient beings to take over the stewardship. But it is the mountains and the rivers that are alive. And our role here, transient role here, is just to safeguard it to the future generations of sentient beings that will continue to safeguard the mountains and rivers.
What a beautiful village.
Let me come back to two questions related to democracy.
Yes.
One is, because of this trouble regarding lies on social media and polarization, the basic idea of ¿cómo se dice libre albedrío? Free will. This basic idea of free will, which is in the foundations of democracy, it's even being put under question. No? Do we have a free will or not? And how do you see that tension? No? Nowadays, where we have several tools that provide us information, no? More information. How do you see the free will and democracy?
I think this is the same situation as, for example, addiction to alcohol or to tobacco. Because social media, when they sell attention to the surveillance apparatus that is advertisement companies or state intelligence, they're basically just manufacturing addiction and making sure that people get addicted, hooked to this constant feeling of fear of missing out. And it's exactly the same as tobacco and liquor companies. I mean, in small doses, I'm sure that it inspires people a little bit. But in large doses, then you cannot live without alcohol. And in that state, people begin to question free will. If you're alcoholic, your free will is seriously dampened. And you do things that you would not otherwise do if you have the free will to think about it. And it's exactly the same with social media. And so I think there's two things that we can do. First is that we can curate a culture. If people care about good wine, they don't usually become good wine, good terroir, good aroma. They don't usually become alcoholic because they're not in it for the alcohol. They're in it for the culture, right? And so if we curate online spaces that can draw people together to form rough consensus, to reflect on each other, to have fun, then people engage and have fun. But they engage maybe 1 hour every day, and they feel that it's good, we had fun, and they go about to do other things in their life. And this is good. It's just like in small doses, alcohol is inspiring, and we're not denying that. And we have to let the children know that you can choose the level of intake, that there are different tastes of social media, that there are good curated wine, and there are just those junk liquors. And if people learn to be connoisseurs of social media, then they become the masters again of their free will.
And in an ideal state, how do you imagine a future form of democracy and living together?
Yes, I think the idea of mountains and rivers having voices from our elders is being recognized other places in the world too. People from the Maori in New Zealand, they go back to Taiwan to visit their ancestor spirit because they originated from Taiwan. The Taiwanese people 4,000 years ago sailed the Pacific Ocean, and so the Pacific Islanders all share the same root language as the Taiwan indigenous people. So they have the same idea. And in New Zealand, they passed laws that enable a river to sit on the board of a company to represent the interests of the river. So the river gets personhood in legal construct. Of course, it's really the scientists, it's really the climate workers, both in the Crown and also in the indigenous tribes, that acts as speakers, people who pakle to speak for the river. But that is important because then the existing governance mechanism for representation is complete. It is clearly just representing the river, because a river is not voting for another river to represent that, right? It's not the same category. So the more that we can represent from the nature, the more externalities or social activities caused on environment, on the society, the culture as a whole, can find speakers for them in our collective consciousness. The better decision we will make, because we are one, and it's not just humans are one. And we are, as I said, just stewards, temporary stewards to those long-living creatures that are mountains and rivers. And I think that is the future that I aspire and look forward.
You know, sorry, I heard, I went to a congress on a different kind of psychology called transpersonal psychology, and one of the people who were speaking there was an American, and I asked him how you see democracy in 100 more years, and he said, I think that everyone is going to be in this game, and nature is going to be also be represented.
Yes.
You know, and we feel the same way. We feel absolutely the same way. And even, you know, what's interesting that the Greeks, although they built the kind of democracy, you know, that we inherited, the river was a god.
Yes.
And each river had a name, and
Yes.
it was a god or goddess. The trees, you know, the plants. And I wonder, maybe we lost that part of democracy because, of course, they had representation.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And that is why we say Internet of Beings instead of Internet of Things.
Yes.
Because if you have sufficient devices to reflect the accurate mood of the river, then it becomes a social being that can participate in democracy. And I think that is the important part when we're deploying those IoT devices to realize their potential of building Internet of Beings, not necessarily just with humans.
Exactly. No, and you know, there must be so many beings here.
Yes.
Audrey, thank you for this
Yeah, we
deep,
are really.
this deep and sincere conversation. Now that you are digital minister, how is your relation or collaboration with Globe Zero? Because we would love to continue learning what you are doing in Taiwan. You as a
Yeah,
group.
I still come to the GovZero hackathon. And every
we
week.
would love also to travel to Taiwan
Yes.
to learn and to be next to you to see how
Yes.
this works.
And to promote Chilean
Yes.
to learn from
If
Taiwan.
you are around Taiwan in July 21st-ish, you can be at the demo day of our presidential hackathon and learn from the presidential promised 5 teams that are going to transform our public sector. And I think it's, if you Google for presidential hackathon, you can see the timeline. Yeah. But late July.
The initiative with the US is called Digital Dialogue.
Yeah, it's and the URL is talkto, TALKTU, TO, dot AIT, American in Taiwan, dot org, IT,
Okay.
dot org, dot tw. That's it.